Hi guys, welcome to the guidance classes provided by SFI Delhi for CUET entrances. For those of you who are preparing for Central University entrance test for your graduation, we are giving this series of guidance classes in various topics, and today I'll be taking your political science guidance classes. And as you all know, for CUET UG entrances, the NCERT are the syllabus for your entrance exams. And in political science, in 12th standard, there is two textbooks. One is the contemporary world politics, and the other is the India after since independence, politics of India since independence. And the questions that has previously been there for CUET entrances is very much completely based on these NCERTs. So we'll be briefly going through the chapters of this NCERTs, trying to cover up the most entrance point in the most entrance perspective. We'll be trying to cover the textbooks, the chapters in these textbooks. We'll not be going through a very detailed classes of and lectures of these chapters in the textbook, but we'll be giving you an entrance perspective on how like what kind of questions can come from these chapters and how can you crack these questions. These kind of guidance will be provided in these classes. So so today I'll be taking the contemporary world politics card textbook, and in that I'll be starting with the Cold War era. And Cold War era, you know that the Cold War era is one of the most important topic for political science CUET. And in in the Cold War era, there is a lot of content that can be asked as questions, and and we'll be trying to briefly cover most of the important portions in which previously questions has been asked in the last year's exam also. And so coming to the chapter, so in the textbook also you can see that the textbook starts with the from the beginning of Cold War, that is after the end of the Second World War. So in the Second World War, the Second World War lasted from 1939 to 1945, and it was fought between the two alliances, the Allied forces and the Axis power. The Allied forces was the alliances between USSR, US, Britain and France, and the Axis power was led by Germany, Italy and Japan. And the Axis powers finally surrendered to the Allied forces with the fall of Berlin by the Soviet invasion in May 1945, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US in August 1945. So by this, the Second World War comes to an end. And then after this the Great War, what happens is that the whole political scenario of the world changes into a bipolar model, in which two major superpowers emerges, that is the US and the USSR, and the whole international political scenario changes accordingly with this bipolar setup of the world system. So the emergence of the two power blocks of the soon after the Second World War reaches to the Cold War. So the Cold War was an outcome of the emergence of the US and the USSR as two major superpowers rival to each other after the Second World War. And the Cold War, in spite of being an intense form of rivalry between these great powers, it remained a cold and not a hot or shooting war, but instead it remained a cold war in which a lot of ideological it was kind of an ideological war, we can say, in which two contending ideas of capitalism and liberalism of US and communism and socialism of USSR was fighting. And a lot of other forms of rivalries, like the arms race, the space race, all these could be seen, even though there was no direct war between these two great nations. But then there was a lot of proxy wars in a lot of other nations also, which was supported by these two nations, and which can only be seen in the light of the Cold War also. So the two superpowers were keen on expanding their spheres of influence in different parts of the world. As a result, the world was sharply divided into two alliance systems, And starting from Europe was divided into two blocks, that's the Western Europe and the Eastern bloc, in support of the two powers. And the Western European countries were majorly in support of US, while the Eastern bloc was in support of the USSR. And there was a lot of alliance systems which was formed as part of the Cold War. Soon after the Second World War, a lot of alliance systems were formed in support of these two different two superpowers. And one of the major important alliance that from which questions can be asked is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was formed in April 1949. It was led by US, and it was an alliance system of 12 Western European countries. So, in regarding NATO, NATO existed as a not only as an economic alliance, it was a majorly a military alliance, in which if any one member of NATO is attacked by any other state, all the it would be seen as an attack on all these 12 members who is part of NATO. So, it was a collective military alliance formed by the US. It was led by the US. And in the Cold War period, this NATO was very much active, and even after the Cold War, NATO expanded its sphere of influence into the Eastern European nations also later. So, as a result of after the formation of NATO, as an answer to this, the Warsaw Pact was formed in May 1955, which was led by USSR in an alliance of 7 Eastern European countries. Around 7 Eastern European countries were also part of this Warsaw Pact, and Warsaw Pact also was seen as a military alliance. It was formed as an answer to NATO. And then there are several other alliance systems also, which is mentioned in the NCERT textbook, which can from which there can be a lot of questions coming for your entrance, and that is the SEATO, South Asian Treaty Organization, and the CENTO, that is Central Treaty Organization. So, SEATO is formed in September 1954. It was also built by the US to expand their influence in East, Southeast and West Asian nations. And the Central Treaty Organization was also in support of the US, and it was led by UK, Turkey, Pakistan, Iraq and Iran. So, it was a the Central Treaty Organization is also known as the Baghdad Pact. It was formed in February 1955, and in through the CENTO, through the Central Treaty Organization, US tried to build and expand their sphere of influence in the Middle Eastern countries and in the Middle Eastern areas. So, that's how US started expanding their support system. They started expanding their alliance systems, and SEATO, CENTO, all these are alliance systems formed by US. And there can be a lot of questions from here, like in which year which all alliances were formed, which all nations were part of it, for which areas were these alliances formed. All kinds of questions can be asked from these portions. And as a result of this kind of influence that US was gaining in the Asian subcontinent, USSR responded to this with the support of China, North Korea, Vietnam and several other Asian nations, which was in support of USSR at that time. And then when we are talking about these kind of alliance systems, which basically divided the world into a bipolar setup, there came a resistance to this, which was known as the non-alignment movement. So, the non-alignment movement was a forum. It was formed by a newly independent, formed by a lot of newly independent states, which was not formally aligned with any of this power bloc, but then they formed this this movement for not to align with any of these power blocs. That is, most of the newly independent states which came out of colonization just now, they didn't want to give up their sovereignty. They didn't want to give their independence to any of these superpowers. So, they, in order to assert their sovereignty, they started this movement of non-alignment, in which they will not be aligning with any of the superpowers, but will be actively interfering in the world affairs in order to limit the effects of Cold War, or limit the effects of this bipolar setup. And India was also a major leading member in the non-alignment movement. we were also part of the founding members of non-alignment. It was formed in 1st September in 1961 in Belgrade. The founding figures of NAM are Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister of India; Joseph Broz Tito, who was the President of Yugoslavia; Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the President of Egypt; Sukarno, who was the President of Indonesia; and Kwame Nkrumah, who was the President of Ghana. So these five, there can be questions of from this portion also regarding who were all the leaders or the founding figures of NAM. And so regarding NAM is a very important topic, like because we were also a big major part of NAM. Like we should be very thorough with the details, the events that is important regarding NAM. So please be sure about that. And in your textbook of NCERT, there is a Cold War timeline that is given. So that a lot of questions can come from that single box, because a lot of information is there in that one single box. So I'll just briefly explain the Cold War timeline, the major events, and what all are the major things. So in 1947, the Truman Doctrine was formed, and Truman Doctrine is the foreign policy doctrine of US, which is named after the US President Harry S. Truman. And this Truman Doctrine is also known as like the Truman Doctrine aims at the containment of communism around the world. So basically, soon after the Second World War, and when the two superpowers were emerging as the into a bipolar setup, what happened was that the US came up with their foreign policy of containing communism wherever it is spreading up. So that's why the Truman Doctrine, which later which later defined the course of US foreign policy, is very important for us to learn, because US basically decided wherever the influence of USSR, wherever the influence of communism is spreading, US will actively interfere there to contain that influence, to limit that influence. And that was an official foreign policy of US at that point of time, and that is the Truman Doctrine, and it was made in 1947. And in 1947 to 1952, there was the Marshall Plan. There has been previous year also there has been a question regarding what is Marshall Plan and all. So Marshall Plan was then a huge economic aid that was given by the US to the Western European nations, which was like severely war struck by after the Second World War. The Western European countries were severely damaged, the infrastructures were damaged. So in order to develop their infrastructure, in order to rebuild these nations, America actively gave a lot of economic aid for them, and the Marshall Plan is such an aid that is given by America to the Western European countries in 1947 to 1952. Then in 1948 to 1949, there is the Berlin blockade by Soviet Union, and in 1950 to 1953, there is the Korean War, which was a proxy war fought by USSR and US in Korea. It can be seen as that. And then 1954 to 1975, there is the American intervention in Vietnam and the Vietnam War. So America intervened in Vietnam, and the big Vietnam War, which is one of the major events of Cold War, happened during this time. It was a big timeline of invasion, intervention, and eventually American troops had to go away from Vietnam after failing in the Vietnam War. And in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by US happened, and that is US invaded Cuba through the Bay of Pigs, and the construction of Berlin Wall also happens in 1961. And like soon after this Bay of Pigs invasion, certain incidents started piling up, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We will be explaining a little more detail about Cuban Missile Crisis in the next slide. So in 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and which was one of the very important event which happened during the Cold War, which can be seen as a point in which a nuclear war was in purview, and which also which didn't happen also. So that is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And in 1965, American intervention in Dominican Republic happened. 1968, Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia happens. 1979 and 1988, Soviet intervention in Afghanistan happens. 1989, the fall of Berlin Wall. So this is the point in which the disintegration of USSR is in the purview. So in 1989, the fall of Berlin Wall happens. 1990, unification of Germany happens, and 1991, disintegration of Soviet Union. Basically, USSR has been disintegrated, and the Cold War era comes to an end in 1991. So this is the timeline of Cold War, and these are some of the major events that happened in the time of in the period of Cold War. So coming to the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a 35-day confrontation between US and USSR, which escalated to an international crisis when American deployment of missiles in Italy and Turkey were matched by Soviet deployment of similar ballistic missiles in Cuba. So like as I told, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba was in a big threat from the US, and Cuba was also a big ally of USSR at that point of time. And Cuba has a very strategic role to play here, because Cuba comes very near to US and it is a very close ally to USSR. So for USSR, Cuba was seen as a very strategic ally at that point of time. And as US tried to invade Cuba through the Bay of Pigs invasion, the USSR supported Cuba by planting similar ballistic missiles, which US did in Turkey and Italy. In like when US planted missiles in Turkey and Italy in order to threaten USSR replied to it by deploying ballistic missiles in Cuba. And this was the first time in which a close-range nuclear missiles were threatening US at that point of time. And this became to an international crisis, because at any point of time a nuclear war could have broken out at this point of time. And in your NCERT textbook, a lot of other details are also given. Please go through that. I will not be getting into the complete story of Cuban Missile Crisis. I will just briefly discuss it here. So it is considered, as I told, it is considered as the closest confrontation which could have escalated into a full-scale nuclear war during the Cold War era, but it didn't happen, as the crisis ended with Soviet Union agreeing to remove the nuclear missiles from Cuba and US agreeing to never invade Cuba without direct provocation from the Cuban side. And these decisions were made with a lot of negotiations between the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and US President John F. Kennedy, who both of them were the leaders of the two superpowers at that time. And after a serious amount of negotiations, they came to this conclusion, and peace was again restored after that. So apart from this, there is a lot of arms control treaties which are mentioned in the NCERT textbook. And the major arms control treaties are the Limited Test Ban Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT 1, and the second round of it, SALT 2, and then there is Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, that is START 1, and then the second round of it, START 2. So what is the Limited Test Ban Treaty? So the Limited Test Ban Treaty basically banned nuclear weapon testing in atmosphere, in outer space and in underwater, and it was signed by UK, US and USSR in Moscow on 5th August 1963. It entered into force on 10th October 1963. And all of these informations are there in the NCERT. You can go through that. And Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it basically allows only those countries which has nuclear weapons before January 1967. So they can whoever has nuclear weapons before January 1967 are considered as nuclear states, and these nuclear states can keep the nuclear weapons for them, and no other new countries will be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons anymore. That was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it was signed in Washington. It was signed in Washington, London and Moscow on July 1968. It entered into force on 5th March 1970, and it was extended indefinitely in 1995. So the 5 nuclear weapon states are US, now Russia, France, Britain, and China. And other than that, India didn't sign this treaty because India considered this treaty to be very discriminatory, in the sense that these five nations will be having the right to keep it, while no other states will be able to acquire any of the nuclear weapons. So India, rather than that, India was asking for complete proliferation of nuclear weapons, that no one should be having any kind of nuclear weapons. India was arguing for that, and India never signed this nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And the strategic arms treaty limitation talks were done it was done in November 1969 between USSR and US, and it was done between Leonid Brezhnev and Richard Nixon, who were the leaders of these nations at that time. And they signed several treaties, and some of the two treaties were the ABM treaty, the limitation of anti-ballistic missiles, and then the agreement on the limitation of strategic offensive arms. So there was two treaties signed in the SALT I agreement, and in the second round of it, the leaders were Leonid Brezhnev, and the US president at that time was Jimmy Carter, and it was signed between these leaders, and they signed the treaty on the limitation of strategic offensive arms in Vienna on 18 June 1979. So then there is the START, that is Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. It was signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and the US President George Bush Sr. on the reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms in Moscow on 31st July 1991, and START 2, which was signed by Russian President Boris Yeltsin and US President George Bush on Moscow on 3rd January 1993. So these are the major arms control treaties. There can be questions from that this portion. There can be a lot of match the following questions also. So please be sure that you know the details, like the years and the major years, the events, the leaders who signed it. All these informations are very important for your entrance, because questions can come, very factual questions can be asked from these portions. Then coming to the new international economic order, which is also mentioned in the NCERT. So the new international economic order was originated from the realization that without sustained development of the non-aligned countries, which was newly independent, mostly the third world countries, which was also considered as least developed countries, these countries this realization that these countries should be economically developed, and there should be sustained development happening in all these countries, only through which we can ensure the independence or sovereignty of these countries. So that's how this new international economic order emerged. United Nations Conference on Trade and Development brought out a report in 1972, which is titled as Towards a New Trade Policy for Development. In this report, there was several reforms were suggested, several reforms in order to support these least developed countries, like the Western countries or the developed countries will not be able to take over the resources in the least developed countries. Some a lot of these kind of reforms were put forward by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. But then so by this time, in the mid 1970s and by the 1980s, NAM was also, that is the non-alignment movement, was also giving a larger importance to economic issues, and they were discussing economic issues a lot. And by the end of 1980s, NAM became an economic, NAM almost changed as an economic pressure group at this point of time. But however, this new international economic order, the initiative for this, which faded away mainly because of a lot of opposition from the Western countries, from the opposition of the majorly developed other countries. So that is regarding a new international economic order. And then India and the Cold War. So there is a portion regarding how India was participating during this period of Cold War. So India took particular care in staying away from the two alliances and raised its voice against the newly decolonized countries becoming part of these alliances. So like you can see soon after independence, India's foreign policies were guided by a very idealistic outlook, which means that like we came out of colonization, and India actively supported decolonization movements all around the world. And the initiative of NAM was also taken from the purview that the newly independent states should not be compromising their sovereignty in any sense to any of the huge powers. So that's how the NAM was also like emerged. So India took particular care in staying away from the two alliances, and it also was against this newly formed countries joining in any of the alliances. India condemned that also, but India was in favor of actively intervening in world affairs to soften Cold War rivalries. That is like this NAM, the whole initiative of NAM or non-alignment doesn't mean that India would be staying away from all the international matters and would not be commenting or would not be interfering in any of these issues, world affairs. But India actively took part in certain actively intervened in the world affairs, and it was to soften the Cold War rivalries. And this is like this is particularly been we can understand this from the formation of NAM itself. But later after the towards the end of the Cold War and all, India was having good relations with USSR, and we were having more we were getting more trade relations with USSR. And in 1971, India signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union for 20 years, and which was this is like critics regard this as virtually joining the Soviet alliance. But yeah, India was more closer to the USSR than the US during the time of Cold War. We had a lot of support coming from Soviet Union. Even with the planned developments of India, we got a lot of like resources and support from the Soviet Union. So that's it regarding the Cold War. That's it regarding this chapter of Cold War in regards with the entrances. So here some key points are there, like Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the major wars that happened, that is the Korean War, the Vietnam War. All these can be questions for your CUET entrances. So please make sure that you go through the chapter very thoroughly. And thank you all for listening to the CUET guidance classes provided by SFI Delhi. I request you all to subscribe our channel, and also to share these classes with your friends if you find it useful. And thank you all.